I want you to picture a map right now. Like if you're not driving or doing something dangerous, just close your eyes for a second and visualize the Middle East.
Yeah, just get the geography in your head.
Right. So zoom in on the Arabian Peninsula and then trace your way over to that incredibly narrow strip of water separating Iran and Oman. I'm talking about the Strait of Hormuz.
It's tiny, really.
It is. At first glance, if you were just looking at a globe, it looks like this geographic afterthought, just a tiny blue bottleneck. It's roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But the actual shipping lanes...
The navigable part.
Yeah, the shipping lanes themselves are literally only 2 miles wide in either direction. And through that specific super narrow corridor passes roughly 1/5 of the entire world's global oil consumption, plus, massive volumes of liquefied natural gas.
It's staggering when you actually look at the volume.
Right. You have these major exporters, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Iran. Their entire economic survival relies utterly on moving energy through just, those 4 miles of navigable water.
I mean, it represents the single most concentrated vulnerability in the entire architecture of the global energy system.
And this brings us to what we're going to get into today in this deep dive. It's this massive financial paradox. Because if absolutely nothing happens in New York or London or Frankfurt or Shanghai, why does a localized incident, say a single commercial tanker being detained near Oman, cause global bond yields to swing violently by the afternoon?
Yeah, it's a massive overreaction if you only look at it as an energy story.
Exactly. Why do equity markets suddenly rotate? Why does gold catch a bid? It is literally as if the entire global financial apparatus catches a fever the instant someone, sneezes near the Musandam Peninsula.
Well, so the market is not merely reacting to the price of a barrel of crude oil in that scenario.
Right.
It's reacting to a mirror being held up to the entire globalized economy. Over the past several years, the Strait of Hormuz has transformed from this simple geographic energy choke point into what we call a market regime indicator.
Okay, a regime indicator. Let's define the mechanics of that for a second. Because in financial media, you hear the word regime thrown around constantly, right? You have inflation regimes, volatility regimes.
It's a buzzword.
Yeah. But when macro strategists look at Hormuz as a regime indicator, what structural conditions are they actually measuring? Like, what is the indicator pointing to?
They are measuring the structural integrity of the macro environment itself.
Okay.
Because a regime indicator isn't a data point like a monthly jobs report or a consumer price index print. It's not a single number on a screen.
Right. It's not like looking at CPI.
Exactly. It is the underlying lens through which every single piece of data is interpreted. When traders monitor maritime traffic through Hormuz today, they are actually stress testing 4 distinct pillars of our reality.
4 pillars. Okay, what are they?
The health of globalization, the stability of fiat currencies, the durability of the unipolar geopolitical order, and the underlying liquidity in the financial system. So they are actively pricing in the fragility of the foundations of the modern economy.
The fragility. Okay, to understand why the market is pricing in that fragility today, we really have to contrast it with how markets behaved, well, not that long ago.
Right, the previous regime.
Yeah. I like to think of the pre-2020 global economy as this luxury car with a state-of-the-art, almost magical suspension system,
I love that analogy.
Yeah, so you could hit a pothole, which in this case is a regional conflict, or a brief blockage in a canal, some localized political crisis, and the shock absorbers of the global economy would just dampen the impact. You'd feel a tiny bump, but the coffee in your cup holder wouldn't even ripple.
Right, it just absorbed it entirely.
Because those shock absorbers were forged from, cheap manufacturing, hyper-efficient just-in-time logistics, unhindered maritime transit, and this overarching belief in diplomatic stability.
That luxury car analogy perfectly describes the prevailing market regime from, I'd say, the 1990s all the way through the late 2010s. We operated under what you could call an episodic noise framework.
Episodic noise.
Yeah. During that era, any geopolitical friction in the Middle East was categorized by capital markets as a temporary inconvenience. It was episodic noise rather than a structural threat to the engine.
So oil might experience a temporary premium, right?
Exactly. Oil spikes a bit, inflation expectations see a minor upward blip, and central banks might verbally intervene or tweak policy at the margins just to, cool speculative fervor.
But things would just go back to normal.
Inevitably, the system would revert to the mean. It always did.
See, I struggle to understand the sheer confidence of that era. I mean, traders and central bankers treated geopolitical conflict as a purely localized phenomenon. Were they just completely complacent, or was there actual, empirical data justifying the belief that the system was completely indestructible?
Oh, the data absolutely validated their confidence. That's why the mindset became so entrenched in the first place. You have to remember, the world was experiencing a profound disinflationary supercycle.
Right, because of China.
Yes. Following the integration of China into the World Trade Organization and the fall of the Soviet Union before that, the global labor supply effectively doubled.
Which is a massive deflationary force.
Massive! Corporations optimize their supply chains to eliminate all redundancies. They fully embrace the Toyota just-in-time manufacturing model, but on a planetary scale.
No inventory, just parts arriving right when you need them.
Exactly. And because labor was globally cheap, and maritime shipping was virtually free and completely uncontested, any localized spike in energy costs, like a skirmish near Hormuz, was immediately absorbed. It was diluted by the sheer deflationary weight of the rest of the system.
So you're saying the system wasn't necessarily indestructible. It just had massive slack in other areas to compensate for energy volatility. So Hormuz mattered, but a disruption there was just a pothole. It wasn't driving off a cliff.
Precisely. The underlying assumption back then was that economic rationality would always trump geopolitical ambition.
People assumed everyone just wanted to make money.
Right. Markets implicitly trusted that all state actors recognized the mutual financial benefit of keeping the trade lanes open. Therefore, any disruption had to be an anomaly. It couldn't be a new baseline.
But then the suspension snapped. I mean, the muscle memory of the global market has completely inverted over the last few years.
Violently inverted.
Yeah. Today, we don't react to those potholes the same way at all because the structural integrity of the vehicle is compromised. I mean, COVID obviously exposed the fatal flaw in just-in-time logistics.
Which is that optimizing for maximum efficiency completely strips away resilience.
Right. If one ship gets stuck or one port shuts down, the whole factory continent away grinds to a halt.
And that realization forced a massive corporate shift. We went from just-in-time to just-in-case inventory management, which, by definition, is inherently inflationary.
Because you are paying to store things, just in case.
Exactly. You have warehousing costs, financing costs for sitting inventory, but the pandemic was merely the first phase of the breakdown. Then we saw the outbreak of major land wars, which literally redrew the physical map of global energy flows.
Pipelines cut off, ships rerouted.
Yeah. And then came the weaponization of the financial architecture itself. We saw foreign exchange reserves frozen, entities disconnected from the SWIFT messaging system, and these massive, sweeping sanction regimes implemented.
Which introduces massive friction into the global system. I mean, moving capital and goods now requires traversing this minefield of compliance and geopolitical risk.
And that friction acts as a permanent inflationary tax on every single transaction. Simultaneously, while all this is happening, sovereign debt levels absolutely skyrocketed.
Right, because governments injected trillions in fiscal stimulus to bridge the economic shutdowns of 2020.
So you mix all that together, and we transition violently out of the stable globalization regime and into what we now call a fragmentation regime.
A fragmentation regime. Let's ground this in a practical business reality so you can really picture it. Say you're looking at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, right? One that's heavily reliant on complex global logistics. If the CEO of that company sees a news alert on their phone about military posturing and a potential disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, how does that fundamentally alter their capital allocation or their operational strategy today compared to like a decade ago?
It's a completely different reaction function. A decade ago, under the old rule book, that CEO might call their treasury department and say, hey, instruct the desk to buy a few near-term oil futures contracts.
Just to hedge their fuel exposure for the upcoming quarter.
Exactly. The assumption was that the supply chain itself was totally intact. The only variable was the marginal cost of the diesel to move the goods.
Yeah, it was just a math problem.
But today, under a fragmentation regime, that exact same news alert triggers an existential operational review. It's no longer just a math problem. It forces that CEO to question whether the components they manufacture in Southeast Asia will even be able to secure maritime insurance to cross contested waters.
Wow. Because if you can't insure the cargo, you can't ship the cargo.
Right. It forces them to reconsider whether they need to nearshore their manufacturing to, say, Mexico, even though the labor costs in Mexico might be drastically higher.
So it transitions from a simple financial hedging exercise to a complete geographic restructuring of their entire business.
Yes. The alert isn't saying oil might cost $5 more next month. It's signaling that the literal physical mechanism delivering every component of your business model is deteriorating.
And so financial markets are repricing the tail risk of systemic failure.
Exactly. In a fragmented world, a disruption at Hormuz signals that inflation could become deeply embedded and structural. It signals that global supply chains are basically one maritime incident away from seizing up entirely.
Which explains the cross-asset panic we talked about at the beginning.
That's exactly why the cross-asset correlation breaks down. You don't just see energy equities move. You see aggressive rotations out of long-duration growth stocks. You see violent swings in currency pairs and massive repricing in fixed income, all simultaneously.
This highlights a massive, huge conceptual error in how the public, and frankly many professional analysts, view the global economy.
Oh, absolutely.
We mentally organize the economy into a pie chart. We have a slice for the technology sector, a slice for healthcare, financials, consumer discretionary, and then, a slice for energy. We treat energy like it is a siloed, independent variable, just one piece of the pie.
Viewing energy as merely a sector is perhaps the most dangerous misconception in modern finance.
Because it's not a slice of the pie.
No. It is the invisible base layer underlying every other component. It is the foundation of the physical economy.
It's the pie is baked in.
That's a great way to put it.
Everything we interact with is essentially just embodied energy. It's obvious when we talk about transportation or aviation, sure, but it's equally true for food production.
People forget that modern agriculture relies entirely on fertilizers derived from natural gas.
Right. And heavy machinery powered by diesel. The exact same goes for industrial manufacturing, cement production, raw material extraction. You literally cannot mine the lithium or the copper required for the so-called energy transition without expending massive, massive quantities of hydrocarbons.
The physical reality is simply inescapable. Every manufactured good, every shipped commodity, every harvested crop represents a fixed quantum of consumed energy.
Which absolutely shatters the illusion of the digital economy. There's this tendency to view the technology sector, specifically cloud computing and software as a service, as somehow detached from the constraints of physical geography.
Wow. The weightless economy.
Yeah. We use terms like the cloud, which implies something ethereal, weightless, immune to shipping lanes. But the cloud is intensely physically heavy.
The nomenclature is brilliant marketing, I'll give them that. But factually, it's completely deceptive. The cloud is comprised of sprawling, hyperscale data centers. We're talking about facilities covering millions of square feet, packed with tens of thousands of specialized server racks.
And those racks run hot.
Very hot. These facilities draw a staggering, almost incomprehensible volume of electrical power from the local grid just to process the data.
But the processing power isn't even the bottleneck, is it? It's the thermal dynamics.
Exactly. To prevent the hardware from literally melting down under the computational load, an equivalent, if not greater, amount of energy must be expended on massive industrial HVAC and liquid cooling systems.
I read somewhere that you have artificial lakes built purely to dissipate the heat generated by digital commerce.
Yes. Whole bodies of water engineered just to cool servers.
And trace that power back to the source. Because despite all these aggressive corporate investments in renewable energy credits, the baseload power required to run a massive data center 24/7 without interruption, it cannot currently rely solely on intermittent wind or solar. It just can't.
No, the grid doesn't work that way. It relies heavily on natural gas turbines and coal-fired plants connected to the regional grid. And beyond that, these facilities require absolute militaristic uptime.
Because if AWS or Azure goes down for 10 minutes, half the economy stops.
Right. The service level agreements demand 99.999% availability. So to guarantee that, every single hyperscale data center has a massive farm of backup generators on site. Ready to kick in the absolute millisecond there is a grid fluctuation.
And let me guess what those generators run on.
They run almost exclusively on diesel fuel. Massive tanks of diesel sitting right there.
So connect the dots for us. If a shock occurs at the Strait of Hormuz, threatening a fifth of global crude and a massive percentage of seaborne liquefied natural gas, the baseline cost of generating power spikes everywhere.
Everywhere. The diesel required to guarantee the uptime of a data center in Virginia or Dublin becomes vastly more expensive overnight.
Which means a maritime disruption near Oman literally increases the physical cost of hosting a digital software application.
That is wild. The digital economy is completely tethered to hydrocarbon logistics.
It is the revenge of the physical world. And this physical tether is exactly what triggers the inflationary domino effect that absolutely terrifies the bond market.
Right.
Because when energy input costs become unstable, that instability immediately transmits pressure into the foundation of the industrial and consumer economy.
I want to trace the speed of those dominoes, actually, because there seems to be a disconnect between physical reality and market timing.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a shock hits Hormuz today, crude spikes, then maybe a few weeks later, maritime freight rates climb,
Yeah.
the production costs at the factory level rise, then insurance premiums jump, and eventually, maybe months later, those compounded costs hit you and me at the grocery store.
Right, the lag effect. Yeah, the lag. Yet, the bond market panics the exact same afternoon the news breaks. Why do traders violently dump bonds today for a grocery bill increase that is 6 months away?
Ah, because the bond market is the world's most sophisticated discounting mechanism.
Mhm.
Traders aren't reacting to today's inflation print. They are aggressively repricing forward inflation expectations.
Forward inflation. Okay, break that down for us.
Think about it like this. If you hold a 10-year government bond yielding 4%, your entire return is predicated on a huge assumption.
That inflation stays low.
Right. You're assuming inflation will remain low enough over the next decade that your fixed 4% payments retain their actual purchasing power.
Because if inflation is 5%, your 4% yield means you're actually losing money.
Exactly. You have a negative real return. So the moment the market sniffs a structural supply shock,
The calculus changes.
immediately. If traders calculate that a prolonged disruption at Hormuz will inject persistent compounding inflation into the manufacturing base, they realize their 4% yield is basically garbage.
The purchasing power of that future money is eroding in real time.
So they sell the bonds immediately, today. They don't wait for the grocery bill to go up. They dump the bonds, which drives the price down and forces yields up. Every major structural inflationary episode in modern economic history is inextricably linked to this precise mechanism of energy repricing.
Which brings us to the ultimate constraint on the financial system and, frankly, the scariest part of this whole dynamic: the powerlessness of central banks in the face of physical reality.
Yeah, the illusion of omnipotence.
Right? Because for the better part of 2 decades, central bankers have been treated as the omnipotent managers of the global economy. I mean, when the housing market collapsed and the banking sector seized up in 2008, what happened? Central banks engaged in massive quantitative easing. They bought up assets to flood the system with liquidity.
And when the pandemic hit in 2020 and demand cratered overnight,
They slashed interest rates to zero and facilitated historic credit expansion. They solved financial crises by manipulating the supply and cost of fiat money.
which conditioned an entire generation of investors to believe that monetary policy was the cure for any economic pathology.
Right.
If credit markets freeze, expand the central bank balance sheet. If consumer demand collapses, manipulate the yield curve to encourage borrowing.
But the crises of 2008 and 2020 were fundamentally demand shocks and credit shocks. They were financial problems.
Yeah.
The mechanism of a supply shock, like what happens if Hormuz is blocked, exposes the brutal limitation of central banking.
Brutal is the right word.
Because you can conjure billions of dollars out of thin air with a few keystrokes at the Federal Reserve. You literally just update a spreadsheet. But you cannot print a single barrel of light sweet crude.
You cannot print a maritime shipping lane.
And you certainly cannot print the geopolitical trust required to navigate it safely.
To really understand the market panic in these moments, you have to separate the mechanics of a demand shock from a supply shock.
Let's do that, because people mix these up all the time.
Okay, so in a pure demand shock, say a severe recession where unemployment spikes, consumers just stop buying things. They stop buying houses, cars, consumer electronics.
The factories still have capacity.
Yeah.
The raw materials are available, but the buyers have vanished.
Exactly. And monetary policy is highly effective here. By lowering interest rates, the central bank reduces the cost of capital, mortgages become cheaper, corporate borrowing becomes attractive, and you artificially stimulate demand to absorb the excess capacity.
You essentially print money to encourage consumption. You make people feel richer so they go out and buy the stuff sitting in the factories. the problem is a lack of appetite, so you lower the price of the meal.
Right. But a supply shock is a completely different pathology. It is the exact inverse.
How so?
Well, in a supply shock caused by a geopolitical bottleneck at Hormuz, the raw materials required to function simply cannot reach the refinery or the factory. The physical commodity is physically missing from the global inventory. In this scenario, it makes absolutely no difference whether interest rates are at 0% or 20%. Cheap mortgages and 0% auto loans do not teleport a stranded crude carrier past a naval blockade.
You can have the most accommodating credit environment in human history, but it won't put diesel in the backup generators.
Precisely. And this dynamic forces central banks into the absolute worst-case scenario. It leads to stagflationary dynamics.
Which is the nightmare scenario.
It is. The historical relationship between inflation and economic growth, the Phillips curve, breaks down entirely.
Walk us through the mechanics of the policy paralysis there. Because if a geopolitical shock severely restricts energy flows, inflation spikes. But economic output simultaneously contracts because businesses literally cannot afford to operate. What is the brutal fork in the road that policymakers face at that point?
It is a choice between two catastrophic outcomes.
Option A.
Option A is the Volcker approach. The central bank chooses to fulfill its mandate to fight inflation, but because the inflation is driven by an energy supply deficit, not an overheated economy, the only way monetary policy can address it is by violently destroying economic demand until it matches the impaired supply.
Wait, destroying demand? Meaning what?
Meaning they must hike interest rates aggressively to choke off credit, bankrupting marginal businesses and intentionally inducing a severe recession.
So they cure the inflation by impoverishing the consumers so deeply they can no longer afford the energy in the first place.
Exactly. You intentionally cause mass unemployment to kill inflation because you can't fix the supply chain.
That is grim. I mean, truly grim. What is option B?
Option B is financial repression and currency degradation.
Okay.
Under option B, the central bank looks at the contracting economy, looks at the struggling manufacturing sector, and decides we cannot tolerate a severe recession right now. So they pause rate hikes or actively lower rates and resume money printing to support asset prices and government borrowing.
But if they do that, they are letting the energy-driven inflation run completely unchecked.
They are totally abandoning price stability.
And then what happens?
When bond vigilantes and global investors realize a central bank has surrendered to inflation just to save the equity markets or manage their sovereign debt burdens, they rapidly divest from that country's currency. You risk a spiraling devaluation of the fiat currency itself.
It is literally a binary choice between a crushing, engineered recession or runaway inflation leading to currency collapse. Either path radically damages institutional confidence.
And this is the exact environment central banks are mathematically incapable of managing gracefully.
Which explains everything. The panic you see across asset classes during a Hormuz disruption. It's not just about oil. It is the collective realization by capital markets that the superheroes of the last 2 decades are fundamentally powerless.
The tools that fixed the financial engineering crises of the past are entirely useless for the geopolitical and physical crises of the present.
Right. And if central banks are truly powerless to resolve a physical supply shock, then the only thing temporarily propping up the stability of the current system is the underlying currency itself.
The U.S. dollar.
Exactly. Which leads us to a structural analysis of the dollar, because the dollar sits underneath this entire global energy apparatus. You really cannot discuss the strategic weight of the Strait of Hormuz without examining the historical framework of the petrodollar.
The architecture of the international monetary system is inextricably linked to the flow of hydrocarbons. For nearly half a century, the global oil trade has operated as the primary enforcement mechanism for dollar hegemony.
Let's break down the mechanics of the petrodollar agreement for a second, because it's often referenced but rarely understood. It wasn't just this, sudden organic decision. It was a deliberate grand bargain.
Engineered in the early 1970s.
Yeah, largely orchestrated by figures like William Simon, the U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time, right after the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard.
Right. When Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar needed a new anchor. It wasn't backed by gold anymore.
So what do they do?
The agreement struck with Saudi Arabia, and subsequently adopted by the rest of OPEC, established that global energy exports would be denominated and settled almost exclusively in U.S. dollars.
From a mechanical standpoint, this is huge. It meant if an energy-deficient nation like Japan or Germany wanted to purchase crude oil from the Middle East, They could not settle the transaction in yen or Deutschmarks.
No, they couldn't.
They were forced to acquire U.S. dollars on foreign exchange markets first, and then remit those dollars to the exporting nations.
And this arrangement created an artificial, perpetual, and inelastic global demand for U.S. fiat currency.
Because everyone needs oil.
Exactly. Every industrialized nation on Earth required a constant stream of dollars merely to keep their electrical grids functioning and their transportation networks operational.
But the genius of the system wasn't just forcing the world to buy dollars, it was what happened to the dollars after the oil was sold. The exporting nations in the Middle East were suddenly sitting on massive, massive oceans of dollar reserves.
This is the concept of petrodollar recycling.
Right. Explain petrodollar recycling.
Well, the exporting nations needed a highly liquid, deeply secure vehicle to store all this newly accumulated wealth. You can't just put billions of dollars under a mattress. The U.S. financial system provided the perfect vacuum. Those sovereign wealth funds recycled their dollar reserves directly back into U.S. financial assets.
Overwhelmingly into U.S. Treasury securities.
Exactly.
So they took the dollars they earned from selling oil to the world and lent them back to the United States government.
Which created a massive captive buyer base for U.S. debt.
Meaning the U.S. government could run continuous fiscal deficits and borrow money at incredibly low interest rates. It essentially subsidized the American standard of living.
It did. But you have to realize, geopolitical alliances are built on mutual benefit.
Right.
The exporting nations did not agree to this structural dependency purely out of goodwill. There was a critical, tangible trade-off.
The United States had to provide the physical security umbrella.
Exactly. The core of the bargain was that the United States military, specifically the overwhelming blue water capability of the U.S. Navy, would guarantee maritime order.
They were the cops on the beat.
The U.S. took on the role of global maritime police, underwriting the physical security of the global commons, protecting vulnerable regimes, and ensuring that strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz remained open and navigable for global commerce.
So, in exchange for providing this security architecture, the U.S. dollar maintained its exorbitant privilege as the world's unquestioned reserve and trade settlement currency.
It's an incredibly elegant feedback loop.
Military capability and monetary dominance became structurally fused. The Navy patrols the straits, the world trades in dollars, the U.S. prints the dollars, and the exporters buy the U.S. debt.
Yes, but under the new fragmentation regime we've been discussing, that loop is fracturing.
Right, because if the U.S. military is perceived as overextended, or if geopolitical tensions make it impossible to guarantee the safety of those shipping lanes, the protection racket begins to fail.
Exactly. When maritime traffic is threatened, diverted, or effectively blockaded by asymmetric warfare, and the U.S. Navy struggles to immediately restore uncontested passage, global powers interpret this as a glaring structural vulnerability.
We're watching and taking notes.
They are reading the instability at Hormuz not just as a supply chain problem, but as a massive strategic risk associated with relying entirely on a unipolar, dollar-dominated system.
Because if the guarantor of the system cannot guarantee the physical delivery of the commodity, why mandate that the commodity must be priced in their currency?
That is precisely the geopolitical calculation occurring right now. Nations in the global south and across the BRICS coalition are actively engineering the how of de-dollarization.
And to be clear, they are not trying to replace the dollar with a single new hegemon.
Yep.
Right? Like they aren't trying to make the yuan the new dollar.
No, not at all. They are building alternative financial plumbing to bypass the Western correspondent banking system entirely.
Walk us through the mechanics of that alternative plumbing. How do two countries actually execute a massive energy transaction without touching the dollar, SWIFT, or, a New York clearing bank?
Okay, historically, cross-border payments required correspondent banking. If a bank in Brazil wanted to pay a bank in India, they rarely had a direct relationship.
Right.
They would both hold accounts, Nostro and Vostro accounts, at a large Western bank, say in New York or London, and the transaction would be cleared in dollars through that central hub.
Which means it's subject to U.S. jurisdiction and potential sanctions.
Exactly. The dollar was the mandatory translation language, but today we are seeing the proliferation of bilateral local currency settlement.
So trading directly in their own money.
Yes. China and Russia, or India and the UAE, are establishing direct currency swap lines. To manage the exchange rate without referencing the dollar, they are utilizing wholesale central bank digital currencies on platforms like Project Enbridge.
Project Enbridge, what is that exactly?
It uses distributed ledger technology to allow central banks to settle transactions instantly, peer-to-peer, in their local currencies. It completely bypasses the legacy SWIFT messaging system.
Which completely removes the geopolitical leverage of Western clearinghouses.
It isolates the dollar.
But wait, what about the surplus trade balances? Like if a country exports a lot to India, they accumulate a ton of rupees. When an exporter accumulates too much of a local currency they don't necessarily want to hold long term, what do?
They are aggressively accumulating gold.
Ah, of course.
Global central bank gold purchases have shattered historical records over the last few years.
Because gold serves as the ultimate Tier 1 reserve asset outside the fiat system.
It carries zero counterparty risk.
Right. Unlike a U.S. Treasury bond, which is basically an IOU subject to sovereign default or freezing via sanctions, a physical gold bar held in a sovereign vault cannot be digitally confiscated.
So they are monetizing gold as the neutral settlement asset to balance these non-dollar trade networks.
The macro implications of this are just staggering. I mean, it means that when traders watch tensions escalate in the Strait of Hormuz, they aren't just adjusting their commodity models. They aren't just looking at the price of gas.
No, Hormuz has become a real-time, live-fire referendum on U.S. unipolarity.
The anxiety isn't just about an energy deficit. It's about the acceleration of sovereign debt crises, the viability of the petrodollar, and this chaotic transition toward a multipolar financial architecture.
The underlying narrative in the bond and currency markets during these geopolitical flare-ups is fundamentally existential. Traders are literally asking whether the global financial architecture built in the aftermath of the Cold War can survive the realities of a fragmented world.
Which completely shifts how we have to view the map. We began this whole deep dive by looking at a tiny geographic bottleneck between Iran and Oman.
Just a small strip of blue.
Right. But peeling back the layers reveals that the Strait of Hormuz is essentially the microscopic intersection of the four pillars required for the modern financial system to function at all.
Unhindered global trade, uninterrupted energy logistics, the dominance of fiat currencies, and a stable U.S.-led geopolitical order.
It is the physical manifestation of the system's ultimate vulnerability.
If there is a single macro insight to extract from this analysis, it is that the substance flowing through the Strait of Hormuz is not merely liquefied natural gas or petroleum distillates.
No.
The true commodity moving through that corridor is global confidence. It is the unquestioned belief in the durability of the globalized architecture.
And when physical security is compromised, that confidence evaporates.
And the illusion that complex financial engineering can somehow supersede physical geography shatters entirely.
It destroys the myth that central banks can manipulate their way out of a physical supply crisis. It proves definitively that energy is the base layer of civilization, embedded in absolutely everything from agricultural yield to digital cloud infrastructure.
The era of the old rulebook, where geopolitical shocks were categorized as temporary, episodic noise, is over.
We are firmly entrenched in a fragmentation regime.
And the defining characteristic of a fragmentation regime is that localized shocks instantly metastasize into systemic structural crises.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound macroeconomic reality to confront. We establish that every time a tanker is threatened near the Musandam Peninsula, the global financial apparatus begins to price in the fragility of dollar hegemony and the severe vulnerability of global supply chains. The market panics over the mere threat of disruption.
It does.
But consider the long-term trajectory here. If the global system is already this fragile, and international coalitions are actively engineering alternative settlement platforms like Enbridge, accumulating record levels of gold, and establishing bilateral energy corridors that bypass Western institutions entirely.
A parallel system.
Exactly. What happens to the purchasing power of your local currency, the real yield of your retirement investments, and the fundamental standards of living in the West, when the rest of the world finally builds enough parallel infrastructure to just ignore the old dollar system altogether?
I mean, it is the single most consequential economic question of our time.
When the luxury car suspension finally gives out entirely, we are all going to feel the road. Thanks for exploring the depths of this regime shift with us today. Keep an eye on the map.